My Knuckles Bleed for You by feralshadowdemon. Chuuya's head was fuzzy. His eyes were just barely open, and all he could see was strands of his own hair, which were preventing him from seeing much else. The back of his head felt cold, and honestly, all of the back of him felt cold. He was probably propped up against a wall made of cold material, if he had to guess. Chuuya shivered slightly. A sudden chill crept up his spine as he tried to move his arms around himself for an escape from the cold, but something prevented him from doing so. Or more so, someone. "Don't," a familiar voice chided, and a curse escaped from Chuuya's mouth. "I thought you'd know the drill by now." "Shut it, bastard," Chuuya hissed out, managing to open his eyes more, though it took a lot more effort than he wanted it to. A banged-up hand brushed the strands of hair to the side, allowing Chuuya to be able to look around. The tip of his hat covered the upper half of his eyes, but he could still see the corpses of the enemy scattered around, bloodied, severely injured, and some even had missing limbs. Absolutely none of the enemy had survived the massacre. That's when the last piece clicked. Right. They had planned to use corruption to wrap this mission up in a neat bow. Dazai's tongue clicked, and Chuuya's attention returned to him. He had a stupid smirk on his face, which made Chuuya roll his eyes in response before pausing. Something felt strange. His gaze slowly moved down to his hands, and that's when another thing slipped into place. At the moment, Dazai was gently caressing his hands. He opened his mouth to question it, but Dazai flicked his forehead, distracting him. He shot a glare at Dazai. "What the fuck was that for?" "Don't stare at your hands. They look awful right now. I still need to bandage them." Dazai over-dramatically sighed, leaning back as his smirk shifted into a more neutral expression. "Not everything went to plan, admittedly. You did get more injured than I thought you would." Chuuya raised an eyebrow. "Eh?" Dazai poked the back of Chuuya's hands, as if to prove a point, and it caused Chuuya to flinch at the sudden surge of pain that hit him, scowling. He then turned Chuuya's hands over, revealing the back of his hand had, strangely enough, scrapes on them. "See?" "The fuck?" "I told you. You got more injured than I thought you would." Dazai sighed a little again, letting go of one of Chuuya's hands to move his own hand under his chin. "You wouldn't believe me if I explained how you got those scrapes, though." "You can't just say that and not fucking tell me." Chuuya shot back a response, seemingly irritated, and leaned towards Dazai slightly. "What happened?" "You protected me." He paused, busting out into a weak laugh at that. "Me? I protected you?" "I know, I couldn't believe it either." Dazai gave him a grin. "But you did. I told you, you wouldn't believe me. But it did happen, I promised you that." Chuuya shot him a glare. Dazai's promises barely meant anything. Dazai chuckled at Chuuya's reaction, still grinning. Suddenly, Chuuya started having a coughing fit. Some droplets of blood spat out of his mouth, landing on a portion of bandages that were wrapped around Dazai's arm. He cursed under his breath, his vision becoming blurry for a few seconds before returning to normal. Dazai simply stared, waiting until he stopped coughing to take Chuuya's hat off and place it on the ground, before grabbing a spare roll of bandages seemingly out of thin air. It was probably stashed within his coat, though, as well as some supplies that was used to clean wounds. "Stay still. I need to make sure you don't get an infection or die or anything," Dazai said, a smug look on his face. "It's my job to be the one dying, after all." "Whatever," Chuuya muttered, sitting up and remaining still once he was in a comfortable position. "Just get it over with already." Dazai hummed a tune as he began to clean the scrapes, glancing at Chuuya's eyes every time he flinched or grumbled about it. Chuuya himself, of course, just remained still, trying to remember his scattered, blurred, and fuzzy memories. It wouldn't make any sense for him to protect Dazai. Of all people, he hated him. No, hate wasn't even strong enough. He despised Dazai. The only reason he hadn't beaten the shit out of him as much as he could have was because he basically was the only anchor to save him from corruption. Still, even then, he wanted to punch Dazai, and had plenty of times. It made no sense. He just fucking wanted to be able to understand this complex web of emotions, the reason why he somehow trusted Dazai, the reason any of this happened. If he had just... He snapped out of it when Dazai flicked his forehead again. You're starting to lose balance. Don't make my work harder. How's that my problem? Chuuya rolled his eyes, though he did return to how he was sitting before. Dazai ignored his question. After I finish cleaning the scrapes, I'm bandaging your hands up. I'm telling you so you don't instinctively punch me for touching your oh-so-precious hands. Chuuya rolled his eyes, purposely coughing to interrupt Dazai, who just gasped at the interruption. He then pouted at Chuuya, starting to slowly wrap his hands up in the bandages, which made Chuuya unknowingly shift his gaze to watch Dazai do so, his body letting himself relax. Dazai was efficient at it, but it was expected with how many bandages he himself was wrapped in. Somehow, though, while also being quick, he managed to make it fit comfortably almost always the first time. It was so interesting to watch the white, pristine bandages slowly cover the rough red and pink scrapes, seeing it absorb some remaining droplets of blood that tried to bloom out of the injuries. Oddly enough, despite the fact that Chuuya hated any kind of unwelcome touch, Dazai gently holding his hand as he slowly wrapped his hand in bandages was comforting in some way. He wasn't sure why or how. Even the way Dazai secured the bandages was comforting, gently pulling at the end of the bandage to make sure all of it was tight and it wouldn't slip off as soon as he let go of it. Chuuya did flinch while Dazai did this, but that was mostly from the bandage touching his scrapes. He then let go of that hand, and Chuuya subconsciously frowned a little, the frown soon disappearing as the comforting touch shifted to his other hand, the bandages elegantly wrapping themselves neatly around the scrapes. "You don't usually bandage me up after missions," Chuuya commented, his gaze still on Dazai wrapping the bandages around his other hand. "Correct." Dazai glanced at him, a smirk making its way onto his face as he noticed Chuuya watching him bandage his hand. "But I do have to take care of my dog." Chuuya immediately stopped watching to glare at him. "Are you seriously not going to shut up about that bet?" "You agreed to it." "That doesn't— I can't hear you, blah blah blah." Chuuya was about to shoot back another response before he felt the bandages tightening. He paused, realizing Dazai had basically just used that to 1. Provoke him, and 2. Distract him from the pain. The day was getting more and more confusing by the second. Dazai then placed the roll of bandages on the ground, still holding Chuuya's hand as he stood up. "Now, can you stand?" "What?" He blinked, tilting his head to the side slightly. "Try standing." He tried to stand up, but his vision immediately blurred, his head was fuzzy. He heard what sounded like white noise of sorts, as he felt gravity slowly force him to start falling towards the ground, only being stopped by Dazai, who stepped where he was going to fall and caused Chuuya to lean against Dazai instead of falling face first into the ground. "The answer is no then," Dazai snorted, patting Chuuya on the head. "I will admit, I should have expected that due to corruption." "No shit, you ass, don't pat me either," he scoffed, his vision slowly returning to normal as he stood still, and had some support from leaning against Dazai. His head began to become clearer as well, and the headache became more manageable. "You know what that means, Snail." Chuuya paused. Fuck. Dazai, suddenly and swiftly, swept Chuuya off the ground and into his arms, using one arm to support Chuuya's legs, and the other arm wrapping around Chuuya's back. He walked over to the roll of bandages and hat and picked them up as Chuuya held onto him, before placing the hat on Chuuya's head and the roll of bandages onto his hip. "And a tip for next time, don't protect me." "I didn't even mean to protect you, you slimy mackerel." "Well, you did. And now I use my precious bandages on your hands. I could have gotten that sweet taste of death. Admittedly, it would have been painful, so maybe I wouldn't have allowed myself to perish, but..." Chuuya tuned out the ramble Dazai launched into, staring into space as some memories finally resurfaced. He remembered bits and pieces of corruption. He remembered when it began, how he launched himself at the target, and he also remembered beating the shit out of someone, before noticing Dazai getting punched by one of the enemies. Logically, he should have continued to pulverize the opponent he was already locked onto. But something screamed for him to protect Dazai, and he did. It was stupid that he somehow managed to do that, especially in corruption of all things. Whatever, it didn't matter. "So, what have we learned from this?" Dazai said at the end of his ramble, glancing down at Chuuya. "I'm never protecting you again. You are a very loyal dog." Dazai interrupted him before he could finish, a smug grin on his face. Chuuya scowled, sitting up more as he clenched his fist. "Shut the fuck up about that bit, or I'm gonna—" The two bickered the rest of the way back, fortunately serving as a distraction from the pain and injuries for Chuuya, and also serving as some entertainment for Dazai. Unbeknownst to this duo, they, unfortunately, would not be able to stay out of each other's lives for long, and they can blame that on fate.